The paper hit the table like a gunshot. Alfred Talbot stared at the document in Sadie Hale's hand, his jaw tight, his dark eyes burning with something that sat halfway between fury and disbelief. He had ridden 3 days through scorching desert, outrun 2 bounty hunters, crossed what he had been absolutely certain was the unmarked boundary into New Mexico territory without authorization. And now this woman, this quiet, copper-haired woman with ink-stained fingers and the coolest gray eyes he had ever seen, was sliding a legally stamped transit permit across the worn oak table of the Dorado Springs Land Office with the calm composure of someone who had done something extraordinary and found it entirely unremarkable. "You want to explain to me," Alfred said, his voice low and rough as gravel under a boot heel, "how my passage through the Cimarron corridor is legal when I did not file a single piece of paperwork, when I did not apply for any transit authority, and when I crossed that boundary line at half, past midnight 3 nights ago riding a horse nobody but me knows I own." Sadie Hale did not flinch. She did not look away. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her and met his gaze with an evenness that made something dangerous flicker in his chest. "Because I filed it for you," she said. The silence that followed was so complete Alfred could hear the dry desert wind pressing against the single glass window of the land office, could hear the faint creak of the sign outside swinging on its iron hook. He could hear his own heartbeat doing something it had absolutely no business doing in a moment like this. "You filed it for me," he repeated. 6 days ago," Sadie confirmed. She tapped the document. "The survey record I completed on the Cimarron corridor last spring gave me the legal standing to designate provisional transit routes through that passage. Federal Boundary Statute, Section 12, Paragraph 4. Any licensed border surveyor with active territorial credentials can establish a transit corridor for unnamed travelers if the route serves a legitimate purpose and does not compromise existing land grants. I listed the purpose as courier service for time-sensitive documents between the Colorado mining territories and the federal land office in Santa Fe." Alfred pulled out the chair across from her slowly, the way a man sits down when he is afraid that if he does it too fast something inside him will break loose entirely. He sat. He looked at the document again. The federal seal was real. He had seen enough false ones to know the difference. "You didn't know it was me crossing," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the one part of this that made absolutely no sense, the sharp stone lodged in the center of everything else. Sadie was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. "No," she said, "I didn't know it was you specifically." But her eyes moved just slightly to a second paper on her desk. And Alfred, who had survived 7 years in the most dangerous territories of the American Southwest by being the kind of man who noticed things other people missed, saw the name on that paper before she could turn it over. His name, his full name, Alfred James Talbot, written in her precise, careful handwriting. And suddenly, the ground shifted beneath everything he thought he understood about the last 3 days. He had arrived in Dorado Springs, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1884, believing he had made the worst navigational error of his life, believing that the warrant out of Colorado was about to catch up with him in the worst possible way, believing that a woman named Sadie Hale was going to be his undoing. He had been wrong about all of it except the last part. Just not in the way he expected. He needed to go back to how it started. Back to the beginning of the road that had led him here, to this table, to this woman, to a piece of paper with his name on it that should not exist, that had saved his life, and that was rapidly dismantling every wall he had spent 7 years carefully building around the part of himself he had decided a long time ago was better left buried. Alfred Talbot had not always been a man who rode alone. There had been a time, not so long ago in calendar years, but so distant in feel that it seemed like someone else's life, when he had been a legitimate man. He had come west from Virginia in 1876, 22 years old, lean and hungry, and full of the particular confidence that belongs exclusively to young men who have not yet been beaten hard enough by the world to have it knocked out of them. He had taken work as a land surveyor's assistant for the federal government, which was how he had ended up in Colorado, in the mountain territories above Pueblo, where the railroad companies and the mining conglomerates were fighting over every square foot of high-altitude ground, with the kind of vicious energy that made ordinary men keep their heads down and their opinions to themselves. Alfred had not kept his opinions to himself. He had found the fraud in the land surveys. He had documented it carefully, methodically, the way the assistant to a government surveyor learns to document everything, because the government only trusts what it can see on paper. The Halloway Mining Consortium had been falsifying boundary markers across 4,000 acres of federally protected land in order to extend their claim into territory that legally belonged to a coalition of small homesteaders who had been farming those foothills since before the railroad ever dreamed of coming through. He had taken his documentation to the Federal Land Office in Denver. The Federal Land Office in Denver had, after a polite 3-week pause, returned his documents to him with a note explaining that the survey records had been reviewed and found to be within acceptable parameters. 2 weeks after that, the man he worked for, a decent surveyor named Gerald Marsh, had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine that everyone agreed was very tragic and almost certainly an accident. Alfred had understood the message. He had also understood that the only reason he himself was still breathing was that whoever had sent the message did not yet know how much he knew or how well he had hidden his copies. He had taken his copies, his horse, his guns, and his considerable talent for disappearing, and he had left Colorado with a speed that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with survival. That had been 3 years ago. Since then he had moved through the territories in a pattern that made sense to no one, because it was designed to make sense to no one. He carried documents when people needed documents carried. He served as a hired gun only when the job was clean, and the cause was something he could live with, and he trusted nobody with his real name or his real history. He was Alfred Talbot to the people who needed to call him something. He was Mr. Smith, Mr. Cross, or just the man from Colorado to everyone else. The warrant from Colorado was not a criminal warrant in the traditional sense. It was a civil warrant for interference with commercial survey operations, which was the Halloway Consortium's way of keeping a legal leash on him from a distance without doing something as dramatic and attention-drawing as having him shot in broad daylight. It meant that if he crossed into Colorado officially, he could be detained. It also meant that certain territorial sheriffs in neighboring regions had been quietly paid to watch for him and report his location, which was a considerably less formal arrangement, but no less real. He had been in Trinidad, Colorado, in early April of 1884, when he heard that one of those sheriffs, a man named Cutter working out of Las Animas County, had gotten specific information about Alfred's whereabouts and was coordinating with the Halloway Consortium's hired men to intercept him along the southern route. Alfred's informant in Trinidad, a bartender who owed him a favor and was constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, had also helpfully informed him that the Halloway men had been asking questions about the Cimarron corridor, which was the obvious path south into New Mexico territory. The obvious path was therefore a trap. Alfred had taken the Cimarron corridor anyway, because the alternative was a 40-mile detour through terrain that his horse could not cover fast enough, and because he had a habit, carefully cultivated over 3 years of survival, of doing the thing people expected him not to do. He had crossed at midnight in the dark, using landmarks he had memorized from his surveying days, and he had been entirely certain that he was crossing the boundary at a point that was at least 2 miles east of any recognized transit corridor. He had been, as it turned out, crossing at a point that a woman named Sadie Hale had officially designated as Provisional Transit Corridor 7 in her spring survey report, filed with the Federal Land Office in Santa Fe 4 months before Alfred had ever heard of her. He had arrived in Dorado Springs 3 days later, dusty and wary, intending to stay exactly long enough to rest his horse and confirm that the Halloway men had not followed him south of the line. He had gone to the land office to get a sense of the territorial records, which was his habit in any new location, because knowing the land records of a place was the fastest way to understand who held power there and what kind of trouble might be waiting. He had not expected the land office to contain Sadie Hale. He had especially not expected Sadie Hale to hand him a transit permit with his name on it. She was not what the land office had made him expect. The building itself was a modest adobe structure on the main street of Dorado Springs, unremarkable in every physical respect, with a painted sign and a hitching post and a step that needed replacing. The interior smelled of paper and lamp oil, and the particular dry heat of a room that spent most of its days with the window shut against the desert wind. Everything about it said administrative outpost, federal bureaucracy, a place run by some minor government functionary who spent his days stamping papers and looking forward to his pension. Instead, there was Sadie. She was 28 years old, though Alfred did not know that yet on the first morning. She had the kind of face that took a moment to read correctly, not because it was complicated, but because it was so entirely unguarded that you kept expecting to find something hidden there, and kept not finding it, which was itself the most disorienting thing about her. Her hair was a deep auburn that looked brown in certain light and the color of a sunset in others, pulled back with the practical efficiency of a woman who used her hands all day and had no patience for hair that got in the way. Her hands were, as noted, ink-stained. Her desk was covered in maps, not decorative maps, working maps. Covered in notation in a small, precise hand, with distances marked, with boundary markers identified, with terrain features cross-referenced against federal land records, in a system that Alfred, who had spent 4 years learning that system professionally, could see at a glance was not only correct, but considerably more detailed and sophisticated than anything the federal government had officially required of its territorial surveyors. That was the first thing that caught him. He had come in asking general questions about the territorial records, keeping his voice neutral, keeping his posture easy, presenting himself as a man passing through with no particular history or urgency. Sadie had answered his questions about the land records with the brisk competence of someone who knew her work thoroughly and had no interest in performing modesty about it. She had pulled the relevant documents without hesitation, had cited section and paragraph numbers from federal land statute from memory, and had, about 7 minutes into their conversation, said something offhand about the Cimarron corridor that made every instinct Alfred had developed in 3 years of looking over his shoulder snap to attention like a dog that hears a sound it recognizes. She had mentioned in the same tone one might mention the weather that the transit corridor through the Cimarron had seen unusual traffic in the past week. Alfred had kept his face completely still. What kind of unusual, he had asked. Sadie had looked at him then, not the polite glance of someone answering a casual question, a look, direct, assessing. The look of a woman who was extremely good at her job and who had, Alfred realized with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the desert heat, just made a connection she had perhaps been waiting to make since he walked through the door. "The kind that interests me professionally," she said. "And possibly the kind that should interest you personally." That was when she had put the transit permit on the table. Alfred stared at his own name on the second document for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. "How long have you known I was coming?" he asked. Sadie was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "Long enough." "That is not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She stood up from the desk, which was the first time he registered that she was taller than most women of his acquaintance, nearly 5'8", with the straight back and deliberate movement of someone who spent significant time outdoors on physical surveys rather than sitting at a desk. She crossed to a large flat map pinned to the wall behind her and pressed her finger to a point on it. This is where you crossed, 47 degrees north by longitude markers, at approximately the position designated as the eastern terminus of Provisional Transit Corridor 7 in my spring survey report. The corridor runs from this point westward to a connecting route that joins the established Santa Fe Road 2 miles south of the territorial boundary. Alfred came to stand beside her, not because he needed to see the map, but because he needed to understand what she was telling him, and something about the specific geography made it easier to think while looking at it. He was aware, in the precise and inconvenient way of a man who has spent years suppressing inconvenient awareness, of how close they were standing, of the faint smell of cedar that clung to her hair, of the steadiness of her hand against the map. "You filed the corridor 6 days ago," he said. "Yes, but you put my name on the transit record." She turned to look at him, and he was close enough now to see the specific shade of gray in her eyes, not the flat gray of storm clouds, but the complicated gray of winter light on water, with something alive moving underneath it. "I added your name to the transit record 2 days ago," she said. "When I received information suggesting that a man named Alfred Talbot, a former federal survey assistant with documented expertise in the Cimarron region, was likely to be crossing through my designated corridor under circumstances that could be construed as unauthorized passage." "Information from whom?" Alfred asked. His voice was quiet. The quietness of it was not calm. It was the specific quiet of a man who needs very badly to understand whether he is in danger. Sadie held his gaze. "From a contact in the Federal Land Office in Santa Fe, someone who knew Gerald Marsh." The name hit Alfred like a fist. 3 years and the name still hit him like that. He stepped back from the map. He stepped back from her. "Gerald Marsh is dead," he said. "I know," Sadie said. "I knew Gerald Marsh. He trained me. He was my mentor for 3 years before the Halloway Consortium decided he was a liability." Her voice was completely level, but Alfred watched her hands and they were not completely level, and that was the thing that made the whole story real to him in a way that pure information never could have. She had known Marsh. She had grieved Marsh. And she had spent the time since his death doing something about it. "What do you know about Halloway?" Alfred asked. "What do you know about Halloway?" she countered. They stared at each other across the small room for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was, and Alfred had the dizzying, disorienting, entirely unwelcome sensation of recognizing someone, not in the ordinary sense of having met before, in the deeper sense of meeting a person whose interior landscape resembles your own in ways that are both comforting and terrifying. "Sit down," Sadie said. "This is going to take a while." It took the rest of the morning. Sadie Hale had come west herself in 1877, a year after Alfred, though from different territory and with different circumstances. She had grown up in Ohio with a father who was a land surveyor, the kind of surveying work that was done county by county for modest fees, by men who knew the legal geography of their region the way farmers knew their fields. Her father had taught her the work, because she was the one who could hold the detail in her mind, the one who could read a topographical feature and translate it directly into a boundary understanding without having to work through the intermediate steps. He had said she had a gift for space, for understanding where one thing ended and another began, for the invisible lines that human beings drew across the physical earth and called law. She had come west because the federal government's Bureau of Land Management had been quietly expanding its survey operations in the southwestern territories, and because a certain forward-thinking regional superintendent had been willing, in 1877, to take on a female surveyor as a provisional assistant. The superintendent's willingness had been partly progressive principle, and partly the fact that Sadie Hale came with credentials and a portfolio of survey work that made even the most skeptical of his senior staff reluctant to argue with him openly. She had met Gerald Marsh in 1879, when she was 23 and he was 51, and he had taken one look at her work and told her she was the best natural surveyor he had encountered in 30 years of the profession. He had become her professional mentor and her closest friend, and the person who had, in the months before his death, been quietly building a case against the Holloway Mining Consortium for land fraud on a scale that the federal government was going to find very difficult to ignore. When Marsh died, Sadie had not fled. She had stayed. She had taken the position of chief boundary surveyor for the Dorado Springs Federal Land Office, which put her directly on the New Mexico side of the territorial boundary with Colorado, which was the boundary that mattered most to anyone who wanted to document what Holloway had been doing. She had continued Marsh's work with the quiet, methodical, entirely implacable determination of a woman who understood that the most powerful thing she possessed was knowledge of exactly where every line was drawn and exactly who had crossed it. She had also, over the course of 2 years, built an informal network of contacts throughout the territory, other surveyors, land office clerks, railroad engineers who knew the difference between a proper survey and a falsified one, and one particular contact in the federal land office in Santa Fe who had known Marsh and who shared Sadie's conviction that what had happened to him could not be left unanswered. That contact had sent her word about Alfred Talbot 3 weeks ago. The picture that emerged from the conversation in the land office was one that Alfred had not had access to before, because he had been operating alone, with incomplete information, moving too fast to assemble the full shape of what he knew into something that could be used. Sadie's version of events was slower, more documented, and substantially more damning than his own. She had the survey records. Not just his copies, which he had been carrying for 3 years, but the original falsified records, obtained through official channels by a process that Alfred found himself listening to with a growing, reluctant, involuntary admiration that he could not quite suppress. She had identified, through meticulous comparison of boundary records going back 15 years, not just the 4,000 acres he had documented, but a total of nearly 11,000 acres of federally protected and homesteader-held land that the Holloway Consortium had incorporated into their mining claims through systematic falsification of boundary markers over a period of 8 years. She had a case, a real one. The kind that federal land authorities in Washington could not dismiss the way the Denver office had dismissed Alfred's earlier report, because the Denver office was compromised but the Washington bureau was not, and because Sadie had spent 2 years making absolutely certain her documentation was airtight. The one thing she lacked was testimony. Living testimony from someone who had been present during the survey falsifications, who had a professional understanding of the methods used, and who could speak to the connection between the fraudulent surveys and Gerald Marsh's death. Alfred could provide that testimony. He had understood, sitting across from her in the small land office with the desert sun moving across the floor between them, that this was what she had been building toward since the moment her Santa Fe contact told her about him. She had not simply saved him from arrest by filing his transit permit. She had positioned him, legally and precisely, as a man who had entered New Mexico territory through an authorized corridor, who had no outstanding warrants in New Mexico or federal jurisdiction, and who was therefore in a position to approach the federal authorities without being immediately detained. She had, with 6 days of careful paperwork, changed his entire situation. He should have been angry about it. He was not entirely not angry about it. Being maneuvered, even well and toward good ends, sat poorly with him. He had spent 3 years being his own compass, and the idea that someone had been calculating his trajectory from a distance, had anticipated him, had prepared for him, scraped against something stubborn in his character. But he was also, against his will and better judgment, profoundly, thoroughly impressed. He left the land office at noon with the transit permit in his pocket, and the map coordinates of Sadie's survey territory in his head, and approximately 14 different conflicting emotions that he had no idea what to do with. He found a room at the single boarding house in Dorado Springs, a clean and decent establishment run by a wide woman named Mrs. Delacroix, who charged a fair rate and asked no unnecessary questions. He ate a meal. He sat on the edge of his bed in the afternoon heat and stared at the wall. He was thinking about Gerald Marsh, which he had trained himself to do as little as possible because grief, in his experience, was a luxury that moving targets could not afford. He was thinking about Sadie Hale's hands against the map, the precision of her fingers on the boundary lines, and the specific controlled quality of her emotion when she said Marsh's name, which was the same quality his own emotion had when he said it, which was the emotion of someone who had sealed something away very tight because it was the only way to keep functioning. He went back to the land office the next morning. He told himself it was because they had not finished discussing the case. This was entirely true and also entirely insufficient as an explanation for why he was at the door at 7:30 in the morning, a full half hour before the office officially opened, with 2 cups of coffee from the town's single eating establishment in his hands. Sadie opened the door at 7:15, and she looked at him and at the coffee with an expression that suggested she was recalibrating something internally. "I have questions," Alfred said. "Come in," Sadie said. They worked through the morning again, but differently this time, because the wariness between them had shifted slightly overnight, had become something more like a productive tension, the tension of 2 people who are thinking hard about the same problem from different angles, and finding that the combination of their perspectives generates something better than either could produce alone. Alfred walked her through his survey documentation in detail. The specific technical methods the Halloway Consortium had used to falsify the boundary markers, the particular survey equipment involved, the chain of custody for the records that would tell a competent federal examiner exactly where the fraud originated. Sadie listened with the absolute focused attention of someone who is not just hearing information, but is fitting it in real time into a larger structure she has been building for years. She asked questions that were so precisely calibrated to the gaps in her existing knowledge that Alfred found himself, twice, stopping mid-sentence just to appreciate the quality of the question. She did the same thing with maps that she did with people. She read the landscape of information the way she read physical terrain. She knew where the edges were. The chain of custody for the original marker records goes back to a survey crew working out of Denver in 1876, Alfred said on the second morning, pointing to a specific document in his portfolio. "I have the crew chief's name, a man named Byers. I don't know if he was complicit or if he was just careless, but his signature is on 4 of the original falsified records." Sadie was quiet for a moment, and then she stood up and went to her filing cabinet with the brisk certainty of someone who knows exactly where everything is, and she pulled out a document and placed it beside his. "Byers filed a secondary survey correction on 3 of those 4 records in 1879, she said. Correction that would have restored the accurate boundaries. The correction was never processed. It was logged as received and then the processing record disappears. Someone in the Denver land office suppressed it." Alfred looked at the 2 documents side by side and felt the specific, almost physical sensation of a pattern clicking into place. "Marsh found this," he said. "Marsh found this," Sadie confirmed. Her voice was very steady. "He was taking it to Washington directly, bypassing Denver when he died." They looked at each other. "We need to take this to Washington," Alfred said. "Yes," Sadie said. "I have a contact in the Bureau of Land Management in Washington. A senior examiner named Charles Whitmore, who has been waiting for complete documentation before he can justify a formal investigation. I believe what we have between us is complete." Alfred sat back in his chair. He looked at her across the desk, this woman who had been doing this alone for 2 years, who had been building this case with the quiet, relentless patience of someone who knew that the law was a structure of paper, and that paper could be used as a weapon if you understood it well enough. Who had looked at the same injustice that had sent him running and had instead planted her feet. "Why haven't you sent what you have to Whitmore already?" he asked. "Because I needed the original survey documentation. What I have proves the fraud on paper. What you have proves the method, the intent, and the human cost. Together it is undeniable. Separately it is suggestive." She paused. "I also needed a witness who could speak to Marsh's death as connected to this fraud, a living one. I wasn't with Marsh when he died." "No, but you were in Colorado in the weeks before his death. You filed the original report to the Denver office. The timing, the sequence, the connection between your report and his death, that is the thread that ties the whole thing together. The Halloway Consortium did not want his case and yours to connect. If you testify to what you found and I provide the documentary evidence, the federal examiner will have everything he needs." Alfred was quiet for a long moment. The window light was different at midday, hotter, filling the room with a gold that caught the edges of the maps on her walls and made them look like something antique and significant. "This could still go wrong," he said. Not an objection, a statement of fact. "Yes," Sadie said, "it could. Halloway has money and connections. Even with the documentation, even with the testimony, they could find ways to slow this down, to discredit the evidence, to make things difficult for anyone involved." "Yes," she said again. "And you've been sitting on this for 2 years, alone, in a land office in the middle of the desert, knowing all that." Something shifted in her expression then, something small but real, a minute alteration in the careful composure that he was beginning to read like a language. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of someone who has been seen accurately for the first time in a while and is not entirely sure how to respond to that. "I'm not sitting on it," she said. "I'm building it." He looked at her for a moment that stretched one beat past professional. "I'll send a copy of my documentation to Whitmore tonight," he said, "under your protocols." Sadie nodded once precisely and went back to work. He stayed in Dorado Springs for 3 weeks. It was not supposed to be 3 weeks. The working necessity of the thing was perhaps 10 days, 2 weeks at outside estimate, the time needed to carefully compile, organize, and transmit the combined documentation to Washington in a form that would withstand professional scrutiny. Alfred had settled on 10 days in his own mind as the outside limit, and found himself, at the end of the first week, revising that figure upward with a variety of justifications that would have been more convincing if any of them had anything to do with the documentation. The documentation was going extremely well. That was entirely true. Sadie's organizational system was the most rigorous Alfred had encountered, and the process of integrating his field records with her archival documentation was genuinely complex work that benefited from both of them being present simultaneously. He was contributing things she could not have access to otherwise. She was providing context and legal framing for his observations that transformed them from isolated data points into parts of a coherent, devastating whole. But the real reason he was still in Dorado Springs at the end of the second week was considerably simpler and considerably more inconvenient. He was falling in love with Sadie Hale. This was happening with the particular inexorability of something that had been structurally inevitable from the beginning, like a river finding its way downhill, and Alfred resented it the way a sensible man resents the force of gravity when he realizes he has walked off an edge. It was not happening the way he had imagined in younger and more naive years that such a thing happened to people. It was not a sudden revelation or a single moment. It was a slow accumulation, a tide coming in. It was the way she worked. The absolute, unself-conscious absorption in the task, the economy of her movements at the desk, the way she could hold an entire survey grid in her mind and identify an anomaly at a glance that would have taken Alfred 20 minutes and a ruler to find. The small sound she made, half breath, half word, when something in the documentation connected in a way that confirmed what she had suspected, the soft exhaled there, that she probably did not know she made at all. It was the way she talked about the land. She had a relationship with the physical geography of the territory that went beyond professional knowledge into something that resembled love, the same quality of attention you give to something you care about deeply, the willingness to sit with it long enough to understand it on its own terms. She could describe a survey boundary with a precision that was technical, and then, in the same sentence, describe the way the desert light fell across that boundary at a certain hour with a quality that was something else entirely. It was the evenings. They had fallen into a habit by the end of the first week of eating dinner at Mrs. Delacroix's boarding house dining room, which served the best meals in town largely because it was the only place in town that could be genuinely described as cooking rather than simply heating food. The dining room had 6 tables, usually with 2 or 3 other guests, miners or travelers or the occasional federal inspector passing through the territory. Alfred and Sadie ate at the table by the window, which had a view of the main street and beyond it the wide, darkening desert, and they talked. They talked about the case at first, because that was the obvious and available subject, and because both of them were more comfortable with purpose than with conversation for its own sake. But the case, worked on for 8 hours a day together, eventually ran out of new developments to discuss over dinner, and they started talking about other things. The territory, the law, the specific absurdity of certain federal land regulations that served no purpose Alfred could identify except to make life complicated for surveyors and homesteaders, while providing excellent cover for the kind of creative boundary interpretation that the Halloway Consortium specialized in. They talked about Ohio, which Sadie missed in ways that surprised her when she examined them closely. Not the place itself, but certain qualities of it, the specific green density of the trees, the way sound moved differently in wooded country than in desert. They talked about Virginia, which Alfred had not spoken about to anyone in years, the Shenandoah Valley where he had grown up, the particular quality of light in those mountains that was as different from the Southwest as 2 things could be and still both be called daylight. He told her about his father, who had been a quiet man, a methodical and honest man who had farmed 60 acres for 30 years with the same steady attention he gave everything, and who had told Alfred once that the most important thing a man could be was reliable, which Alfred had not fully understood until he was old enough to see how rare reliability actually was. She told him about her mother, who had died when Sadie was 15, and who had been the first person who told Sadie that wanting to do a man's work did not make her less of a woman. She said the designation of work as male or female was entirely arbitrary and largely designed to keep women from competing in fields where they would otherwise do very well, Sadie said, and her voice had the quality of someone quoting something they have repeated to themselves on a great many difficult days. She was right, Alfred said. Sadie looked at him, and he felt the weight of that look, the careful assessment of whether he meant it or was saying the polite thing. She was right, he said again, and anyone who has spent an hour reviewing your survey work would know it without needing to be told. This time Sadie's expression did something that was definitively a smile, quick and real, and gone before he could fully appreciate it. But he found himself carrying the shape of it around for the rest of the evening regardless. He was not the only one falling, though it took him a while to read the signs correctly because Sadie Hale was quite good at managing her own expressions, and because he was gradually understanding the same habit he had of treating her own emotions as secondary to the work at hand. But there were signs. She had started leaving coffee on his side of the desk in the mornings without comment, which was not a dramatic gesture but was consistent. She had begun, in the second week, to show him aspects of the territory documentation that were not strictly necessary for the case, but that she seemed to want him to see. The survey maps of the Rio Grande boundary, where she had documented a series of natural landmarks that were themselves remarkable. the record of a particular ancient land grant that raised interesting questions about Spanish colonial law that she had been researching for her own interest. She was sharing her work with him the way people share the things they care about. She was letting him into the ongoing project of her mind. And then there was the day she showed him the field survey. She had gone out to recheck a boundary marker at the eastern edge of her territorial jurisdiction, a routine confirmation needed for a section of their documentation, and he had ridden out with her. The day was clear and dry and enormous, the kind of southwestern spring day that felt like an apology for the summer that was coming, and Sadie on horseback was a different version of herself than Sadie at the desk, though the fundamental quality remained the same. She moved through the landscape with a sureness that was not casual but deliberate, reading the terrain as she traveled it, checking her mental map against the physical reality with a continuous, automatic assessment that Alfred recognized, because he did the same thing from habit and training. They found the boundary marker, a concrete monument set 4 years prior, and Sadie dismounted and produced from her saddlebag a theodolite, the surveying instrument used to measure horizontal and vertical angles, along with a measuring chain and a notebook. Alfred watched her set up the theodolite with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times, her hand steady on the instrument, her eye precise at the eyepiece. She took the readings. She noted them. She compared them to her records. And then she straightened up and looked at the surrounding landscape with the specific focused expression of someone who has found a discrepancy. "The marker has moved," she said. Alfred looked at it. The concrete pillar seemed firmly planted. "It looks solid." "It is solid. It was moved and replanted," she pointed. "The original position was 6 feet east. If you look at the soil disturbance around the base, the color differentiation suggests the replanting happened 18 to 24 months ago. Someone moved this marker 6 feet west." She paused, her jaw set. 6 feet is the difference between this parcel falling inside or outside the boundary of the Henderson homestead claim. If the marker is accepted as current, Henderson's water access is cut off. She was already pulling out a fresh stake from her saddlebag, marking the original position, setting up the chain to remeasure, moving with the crisp intentionality of someone who has encountered injustice and knows exactly what tool to use against it. Alfred helped her without being asked, taking the other end of the measuring chain, holding the stakes, reading the distance markers. It took 2 hours there in the sun, but at the end of it they had a precisely documented record of the marker's original and falsified positions, with photographic comparison using the small camera Sadie carried for exactly this kind of field documentation, which Alfred had not known she had until she produced it. A camera, in a field survey saddlebag. In 1884, she had a Scoville Manufacturing Company detective camera, small and portable, an instrument that was available but not common, and that required a specific knowledge of photographic process to use effectively in field conditions. "You carry a camera," Alfred said, and he heard in his own voice something he could not quite contain. "Photography provides evidentiary documentation that written records alone cannot," Sadie said, winding the film advance with the same practical competence she brought to everything. "Where did you learn the photographic process?" "From a book, mostly. And from a photographer who passed through the territory 2 years ago and was willing to answer questions in exchange for my showing him the survey route to the northern ranges." She glanced at him briefly. "Knowledge is generally available to anyone willing to be persistent about obtaining it." Alfred stood in the desert sun with the measuring chain still in his hands and felt something that he could only describe as the ground shifting underneath him, not in the frightening sense, but in the sense of the world reconfiguring itself around a new understanding. He had been, without consciously acknowledging it, managing his admiration for her as one manages a fire, keeping it contained, keeping it useful, keeping it from becoming something that complicated the professional relationship. Standing there with the chain and the sun and her casual mention of teaching herself photographic process from a book, he found that the management was no longer entirely working. He was deeply, helplessly, thoroughly impressed by this woman. And the impression was not the admiration of a professional for a colleague. It was the specific, bone-level recognition of someone who has spent years believing themselves to be fundamentally alone in a particular way, and who has just encountered evidence that this might not be true. He said nothing. He put the chain back in her saddlebag, and they rode back to Dorado Springs. But the thing had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything about it for 3 more days, which was one of the longer 3-day periods of Alfred Talbot's adult life. The response from Washington came on a Thursday afternoon in late April. Charles Whitmore, the federal examiner, had received their combined documentation. His letter, written in the clipped and precise language of a senior government official who had learned to be careful with paper, confirmed that the documentation had been reviewed and that a formal federal investigation into the Halloway Mining Consortium's survey practices was being initiated. A federal marshal would be dispatched to Colorado to begin the official evidentiary collection process. Alfred's testimony had been noted as required, and arrangements would be made for it to be taken formally in Santa Fe within the month. And then there was a second paragraph, which was less official in tone and considerably more significant in implication. Whitmore wrote that in his 20 years as a federal land examiner, he had rarely seen a case assembled with such thoroughness and precision, and that the specific combination of field documentation and archival research presented in the combined report was, in his professional judgment, the most complete evidentiary package his office had received in a decade. He had taken the unusual step of noting in the official case file that the case had been constructed by surveyor Sadie Hale, whose work on the Cimarron boundary surveys had, over the past 2 years, established a standard of documentation that the Bureau intended to recommend as a formal model for territorial survey practice. Sadie read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment. Alfred watched her. "He noted your name in the official file," he said. "Yes, that matters for the record, for anyone who tries to minimize your role in this." Sadie was quiet for a beat. "Gerald would have been pleased," she said. The gentleness in her voice when she said that was something Alfred felt in his chest, a small and unexpected ache that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with knowing a person well enough to know what they carry. "Yes," Alfred said, "he would have." The case was moving to its conclusion, which meant, theoretically, that Alfred's reason for remaining in Dorado Springs was moving to its conclusion as well. He had been aware of this approaching moment with the particular wariness of a man who is not good at staying and has spent years practicing leaving. He knew the shape of departure. He had packed and unpacked and repacked his saddlebags in the dark of the boarding house room more times than he would admit, arguing with himself in the practical, unsentimental terms he preferred. He had what he needed to testify in Santa Fe. Sadie had what she needed for the case. The work was done. He stayed. He did not say why, and Sadie did not ask. And they continued eating dinner at the window table, and they continued talking, ranging farther and farther from the case into territory that was solely and entirely personal. And the evenings grew longer as April moved toward May, and the desert evenings stayed warm enough to take a walk after dinner, which they did on a Tuesday and then again on a Wednesday, and then without discussion it became the pattern. Dinner and then an evening walk along the main road that turned east toward the open desert, where the sky was so broad and so full of stars that it had a physical weight to it. On a Friday evening in the first week of May, they were walking in the early dark, far enough from town that the last lamp light was just a warm smudge behind them and the stars were fully engaged above, and Sadie stopped walking. Alfred stopped beside her. She was looking at the sky, the stars, the vast, indifferent, beautiful sweep of the southwestern night. There are nights, she said, when the scale of it makes the individual problems seem very small. Is that comforting? Alfred asked. She considered it seriously. Some nights, yes. Some nights it is just large. He turned to look at her profile against the darkness, the specific clean line of her face, the thoughtful set of her jaw. Sadie, he said. She turned to look at him. And whatever she saw in his face in that moment, whatever it communicated in the 2 steps of distance between them, made her expression go very still in the way it went still when she was receiving information that required careful consideration. I know, she said softly. I haven't said anything. No, but you were about to. He laughed, a quiet sound that he almost never made, and she smiled at it fully this time, the real smile that she did not hurry away from. I am leaving next week, he said, for Santa Fe to testify, and then I have no particular destination. He paused. That is a significant problem. Why is it a problem? Sadie asked, with the careful quality of someone who knows the answer but wants to hear it said out loud. Because I am discovering that I am interested in a particular destination, Alfred said. Specifically, one that involves a land office in Dorado Springs and the most remarkable woman I have had the privilege of knowing. Sadie was quiet for a moment in the particular way that was not hesitation but thought. Alfred, she said. You should know that I am not a person who is interested in any arrangement that requires me to stop being exactly what I am. I have no intention of leaving this work. I have no intention of making myself smaller to fit a shape that someone else has decided is appropriate. I have been entirely clear about that with myself for a great many years. Good, Alfred said. I have spent 7 years watching what happens when someone compromises their integrity to fit what other people expect of them. I have no interest in asking that of anyone, and considerably less interest in asking it of you, because what you are is the most valuable thing I have encountered in a very long time, and the last thing I would want to diminish it. She looked at him for a long, clear moment under the stars. That is, she said, and her voice had the small, unguarded quality that he had come to understand, meant she was saying something she had not planned to say, an extremely good answer. He reached out and took her hand, which was warm and slightly rough from the field work and entirely itself, and she let him, and they stood there in the dark desert with the stars doing their enormous work overhead, and something that had been building for 3 weeks settling into its proper shape, with the quiet solidity of something that had always been structurally inevitable. They stood like that for a long time. He thought about the transit permit, his name in her handwriting, the specific and entirely extraordinary fact that she had seen him coming and had prepared a place for him to arrive safely. He thought about what it meant to be seen that way, not as a problem to be solved or a resource to be used or a threat to be managed, but as a person whose safe passage mattered, whose arrival had been prepared for. He thought that was possibly the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for him, and the fact that it had been accomplished through federal land statute rather than poetry made it, if anything, more moving. Sadie, he said. Yes, she said, without asking what. The month of May in 1884 was full. Alfred went to Santa Fe and gave his testimony to the federal examiner, a precise and thorough deposition that took 2 days, and that, combined with Sadie's documentary evidence, gave the federal investigation a foundation that the Halloway Consortium's lawyers were not going to be able to shake. He returned to Dorado Springs 3 days after his testimony, which was faster than the trip required, and when Sadie looked up from her desk and saw him in the doorway, she said nothing for a moment and then said, "That was quick." The roads were good, Alfred said, which was not entirely the reason. She stood up from the desk and crossed the room, and he had one moment to register that she was coming toward him before she walked directly into his arms with the decisive, unsentimental practicality of someone completing a task they have been thinking about for several days. He wrapped his arms around her, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and they stood there in the land office in the bright afternoon light, which was the least dramatic possible setting, and somehow entirely right. "I missed the evenings," she said, her voice slightly muffled. "So did I," he said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, into the auburn hair that smelled of cedar and paper and the specific dry warmth of the desert. The summer that followed was the happiest Alfred Talbot could remember. He stayed in Dorado Springs. He found work, which was not difficult for a man with his particular combination of skills, initially as a field assistant on Sadie's survey expeditions, and then, as his presence in the territory became established and his name emerged from the legal uncertainty that the transit warrant had created, in his own right as a surveyor, using his federal credentials which had never been formally revoked. The Holloway investigation moved forward in Washington with the slow but inexorable momentum of a federal proceeding that has enough evidence to sustain it. And by August, the mining consortium had been formally charged with land fraud and survey falsification across 11,000 acres of federally protected and private land in Colorado Territory. Gerald Marsh was named in the official record as a surveyor whose work had been foundational to uncovering the fraud. His name on the official federal record, which Sadie had argued for with Whitmore, and which Whitmore had included as a matter of professional honor, was a form of justice that would never be adequate and was nonetheless real. The Henderson homestead's boundary marker was officially corrected and resurveyed. The Henderson family, a couple in their 50s who had been fighting the boundary dispute for 2 years, came to the land office in August when the correction was finalized. And the woman, a small and weathered person who had the particular dignity of someone who has endured a long-standing injustice with patience and without bitterness, shook Sadie's hand and held it for a long moment without saying anything, which said everything. Alfred watched Sadie's face in that moment, the contained emotion in it. The quality that was grief and satisfaction and weariness and conviction all held together at once, and he thought that he had not known, before this woman, that a person could be both as strong and as tender as that simultaneously, and that the combination was not a contradiction but a completeness. He asked her to marry him in September, on an evening walk in the desert, with the stars doing their enormous work. He had thought about how to say it for several weeks and had decided, after considerable deliberation, that the most honest approach was the direct one, because Sadie Hale had no patience for indirection, and because the thing itself was simple even if the feeling behind it was enormous. "I want to spend the rest of my life in this desert with you," he said. "I want to spend it knowing where every boundary line is and arguing about federal land statute and eating dinner at the window table and being the kind of person worth being because you have shown me what that looks like. I want to marry you." Sadie was quiet for a moment that was not long but felt significant. "I have to tell you," she said, "that I thought about this when you were in Santa Fe. I thought about it quite a lot. And I concluded that I would be considerably worse at my work if you were not here," she said, "which is an interesting way to feel about a person. Is that a yes?" She turned to look at him in the darkness, and he could see her face clearly even without much light, because he had learned her face the way you learn something you care deeply about, in sufficient detail that the light level becomes largely irrelevant. "Yes," she said, "that is a yes." He kissed her then, properly, for the first time, with the full weight of 3 months of accumulated patience behind it, and she kissed him back with the decisive practicality that characterized everything she did, and that turned out, in this particular application, to be the most wonderful thing he had ever experienced. They married in November of 1884, in the small church that Dorado Springs possessed, in a ceremony that was brief because both of them had a strong constitutional preference for brevity in formal proceedings and an equally strong preference for substance. The town turned out for it to a degree that surprised Alfred, who had not fully appreciated how much the territory had absorbed his presence in 7 months of work and evening walks, and the reliable occupation of the window table at Mrs. Delacroix's. Sadie wore a dress that was the deep blue-green of desert sage, which was not traditional but was exactly right for her, and she carried a survey notebook in her coat pocket because they were going to do a field check on their way back from the ceremony, and she saw no reason to make a separate trip. Alfred loved this about her so comprehensively that he could not have expressed it as a single emotion and did not try. The federal investigators' final report on the Holloway Consortium came in December, and it was everything their documentation had promised it would be. 4 senior members of the consortium were indicted on federal fraud charges. The boundary corrections across 11,000 acres were ordered and began the process of official resurvey and restoration. The families of the 14 homesteaders whose land had been incorporated into the Holloway claims through falsified boundaries were notified that their original claims were being reinstated. It was not a complete vindication of everything that had been lost. People had suffered for 8 years under the fraudulent claims. Some of the homesteaders had already sold their land or abandoned their claims rather than fight a powerful mining consortium with unlimited legal resources, and their land could not be easily returned. Gerald Marsh could not be brought back. Justice in the imperfect real world was always partial, always accompanied by the knowledge of the gap between what was remedied and what was lost. But it was justice. It was real. And it had been built, piece by careful piece, by a woman in a desert land office who had refused to accept that the powerful were beyond accountability, who had understood that the law was a structure of paper and had become a master of that paper, and who had, in the course of it, filed a transit permit for a man she had never met and prepared a place for him to arrive safely. Which was the kind of thing that only made sense from the outside if you understood that the woman who did it had a very particular and very remarkable way of loving the world. Alfred understood it. He understood it completely. The winter of their first year was different from any winter Alfred had experienced. He was a man who had spent 7 years in motion, who had learned to sleep lightly and think about exits and keep his belongings in a configuration that allowed for fast departure, and the settling into a place, into a life, into the specific permanence of a home with a woman who was his partner in every meaningful sense of the word, required a kind of unwinding that he had not known he needed to do until he was in the middle of doing it. Sadie was patient with him during that unwinding, in the way she was patient with difficult survey work, not indulgently patient, not in the manner of someone enduring something, but with the active, intelligent patience of someone who is working alongside you and trusts the process. She did not push. She did not require him to be settled before he was settled. She simply continued being consistently herself, in the same place, at the same desk, with the same work and the same evening walks and the same direct, genuine presence that had been, from the first morning, the most stabilizing influence he had known since leaving Virginia. They had set up their household in a house on the edge of town that was a step up from the boarding house, a modest but solid adobe with 3 rooms and a yard large enough to keep 2 horses. Sadie's maps covered the walls of the main room, which Alfred had proposed, and she had accepted with a speed that confirmed it was exactly what she had wanted. His survey equipment shared the storage shelf with hers, which had required some reorganization of her existing system, and about 45 minutes of negotiation that had ended, as their negotiations tended to end, with both of them having made concessions and both of them approximately correct. He found that winter that he slept differently. He had not known until it changed how vigilant his sleep had been for 3 years, how close to the surface, how oriented toward interruption. He found himself sleeping deeply, which woke him several times with the disoriented alarm of a man who has fallen into something unexpected before he understood what it was. It was safety, the specific and irreplaceable experience of being in a place where you were known and where that knowing was benevolent. He told Sadie about it one morning in January, in the flat winter light, over coffee. She listened to him without interrupting, which was one of her particular gifts, the quality of her attention when someone was telling her something true. "I understand that," she said when he was done. "When I first came to Dorado Springs after what happened to Marsh, I spent 8 months sleeping the way you describe, watching for danger that wasn't coming from the direction I was watching. What changed it?" She was quiet for a moment. "The work changed it, getting deep enough into the documentation that I was oriented toward the future instead of away from the past. It's a different kind of vigilance, less exhausting." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. "You changed it for me," he said. "The work helped, but you changed it." Her expression did the small, unguarded thing it did when he said something she was not going to argue with but needed a moment to receive. "Good," she said quietly. "You changed things for me too." Spring came early to the desert, which meant March was already warm and brilliant, the kind of blue sky perfection that the territory offered with casual extravagance. Sadie had a new survey project, a comprehensive review of the boundary regions between New Mexico Territory and the Texas Panhandle, which the Bureau of Land Management had assigned to her explicitly on the basis of her work on the Holloway case, which was the professional recognition she had not asked for, and that Alfred was very proud of on her behalf, and told her so regularly enough that she had taken to preemptively telling him to stop before he had even started. He was assisting on the project, which had grown from the initial scope by about 60%, as Sadie's preliminary survey revealed a number of interesting irregularities in the existing boundary records, which was entirely characteristic of her work, because she had the professional instinct of someone who knew that the first layer of a survey always conceals more layers, and the good work was in finding them all. They were out in the field one afternoon in late March, taking angular measurements on a section of the southern boundary corridor, when Sadie looked up from the theodolite and went very still for a moment in a way that was different from her usual focused stillness. Alfred looked at her. "I need to tell you something," she said. She told him. He sat down on a rock, which he did not generally do mid-survey, and looked at the wide blue sky above the desert and did not say anything for a moment that was considerably longer than the situation strictly required. Then he said, "Sadie." "I know," she said. She was watching him with that direct, assessing gaze, the one that missed very little. "This is," he started and then stopped, because the sentence required a conclusion that was not going to be adequate regardless of what he chose. "Yes," she said. "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her. "This woman." This brilliant, implacable, copper-haired woman who had seen him coming and prepared a place for him to arrive, and who was now standing in the desert sun telling him that the world was about to get considerably larger. "Yes," he said. "I am absolutely all right." He got up from the rock and went to her and held her with the careful, ardent attention of a man who has been trusted with something extraordinary, which was a feeling he recognized because she had given it to him before, though not in this particular form. Their son was born in November of 1885, a loud and emphatic arrival that the midwife described as the most determined baby she had delivered in 15 years of practice, which Sadie said was entirely characteristic, and Alfred said he was not sure whether to take as a compliment. They named him Gerald James Talbot, Gerald for Marsh, which was Sadie's proposal and Alfred's immediate and unequivocal agreement, James for Alfred's father. Gerald James turned out to be, in the assessment of every adult who encountered him in his early years, exactly the kind of child that two people of strong character and significant determination produce when they decide to do so. He had his mother's precise and searching attention, and his father's stubborn self-possession and the specific vitality of a child who has been very much wanted and has internalized the security of that wanting. He liked maps, which Sadie found extremely satisfying. He liked horses, which Alfred found extremely satisfying. He had strong opinions about dinner, which both of them found extremely characteristic and only occasionally exhausting. The years that followed in Dorado Springs were years of building. The Holloway case continued to work its way through the federal legal system with the deliberate pace of a significant proceeding, and by 1887, the major convictions had been secured. 4 members of the consortium found guilty on federal fraud charges, the boundary corrections across 11,000 acres completed, and the Bureau of Land Management's formal inquiry into the Denver Land Office's handling of the original reports, resulting in the termination and legal sanction of 3 officials who had been complicit in suppressing the early documentation. The warrant against Alfred, the civil interference warrant from Colorado, had been dismissed in the course of the investigation as procedurally invalid and issued in bad faith, which was the legal system's way of acknowledging that it had been filed as a harassment tool by a party now itself under federal indictment. Alfred received the notification of dismissal on a Tuesday morning and read it twice, and then folded it carefully and placed it in the same document box that held Sadie's original transit permit with his name on it, which he had kept since the first day in the land office, and which he had shown Gerald James once, when the boy was 4, explaining that this was the document that had made everything possible. Gerald James had examined it with the careful, earnest attention he brought to documents, which was his mother in miniature and entirely delightful. Sadie's professional reputation in the territory, which had been significant before the Holloway case, became substantial after it. She was the surveyor that federal officials consulted on disputed boundary questions, the person that other territorial surveyors wrote to when they had a question they could not resolve with their existing resources. She was asked twice to contribute to the Bureau of Land Management's official survey guidelines, and both times she contributed sections that were precise, comprehensive, and adopted with minimal revision, because Sadie Hale's relationship with precision made revision generally unnecessary. She also trained, over the course of several years, a series of junior surveyors who came through the Dorado Springs office, both men and women, because she had Marsh's instinct for recognizing capacity and his conviction that the work was too important to be done badly, and that doing it well required being willing to teach. Alfred watched her teach with a specific, quiet pleasure that had to do with seeing a person fully in their element, with the confirmation that the world was a somewhat better place for having Sadie Hale professionally engaged in it. He found his own element in those years, which was partly a surprise. He had spent 7 years as a man defined primarily by motion, by reaction, by the requirements of surviving in difficult circumstances. The return to legitimate survey work gave him back the version of himself that had existed before Colorado, the methodical, careful, precise professional who found genuine satisfaction in the act of knowing exactly where things were, and that version of himself turned out to integrate well with the person he had become in the intervening years, as if the difficulty had added something rather than only taken things away. He was a good surveyor. He had always been a good surveyor. Working alongside Sadie made him better, which he would not have predicted before knowing her, but which made complete sense once he understood how she worked, and how the quality of her attention was contagious, how spending days in the field with someone who brought that level of precision to the work inevitably elevated your own. They argued, which was entirely natural given who they both were. They argued about the best route through a particular section of the Southern Survey. They argued about the most efficient organizational system for field documentation, which was a spirited and technical disagreement that lasted 4 days, and ended with a compromise system that Alfred privately thought was better than either of their original proposals, and that Sadie privately agreed with, and neither of them said out loud for several weeks. They argued about Gerald James's education, and about whether the horse Alfred wanted to buy was a good idea, and about the correct level of involvement in a land dispute between two neighboring homesteaders that Sadie thought required intervention, and Alfred initially thought was outside their jurisdiction. Alfred was wrong about the homesteader dispute, as Sadie's subsequent involvement proved, because she had understood from the boundary records that the dispute had been manufactured by a land speculator who was attempting to create instability in the region as a precursor to buying out both homesteaders below market value, which was a pattern she had seen before and recognized immediately, and dealt with through the filing of 4 specific legal documents that made the speculator's position untenable within the week. Alfred told her she was right with the same directness he brought to everything, because he had learned from watching her that acknowledging error was not a diminishment but a precision, and because being the kind of man worth being meant not requiring your own infallibility. In the spring of 1888, Sadie told him she was expecting their second child. This time he did not sit down on a rock. He had more practice with the feeling, which was less disorienting and not at all less enormous. Their second child, a daughter, arrived in December of 1888 and was named Clara Margaret, after Alfred's mother and Sadie's maternal grandmother, and she was from her first hours the most unequivocally certain small person Alfred had ever encountered, which was, he told Sadie, going to be either wonderful or extremely challenging, and Sadie said it was going to be both and was entirely correct. Gerald James, by this time 3 years old, regarded his sister with the specific mixture of fascination and mild professional skepticism that characterized his general approach to new developments. He decided, after approximately a week, that she was satisfactory. This constituted, from a child of his particular temperament, a warm endorsement. The Dorado Springs of 1889 was a different town from the one Alfred had ridden into in 1884. The railroad had come, which changed everything in the practical sense and some things in the philosophical sense, because the railroad always changed the relationship between a place and the wider world. It brought more people, more commerce, more complexity. It brought federal surveyors who needed to work with the existing territorial records, which meant more work for the land office. It brought questions about land rights that had previously been left somewhat vague, which meant those questions now required the kind of precise answering that was Sadie's particular specialty. She hired a deputy surveyor, a young man from Kansas named Thomas Reeves who had excellent credentials and the kind of genuine eagerness to learn that made teaching him a pleasure rather than a burden. She expanded the land office's survey archive, obtained a new theodolite from Philadelphia that had capabilities beyond the instrument she had been using, and wrote to Charles Whitmore in Washington about the Bureau's plans for the railroad boundary surveys, which she had opinions about and was not shy about communicating. Whitmore wrote back with the note that he had come to expect her opinions and found them consistently useful, which was the highest professional praise of his reserved vocabulary, and which Sadie read aloud to Alfred over dinner with an expression that combined satisfaction with the specific delight of a person who has received good news from a respected source. Alfred kissed her on the side of the head, and she said stop that, and he did not stop that, and she allowed it, and they ate dinner at the window table, which they had moved to the new house when they left the boarding house, and which remained their preferred location for the evening meal, with the wide street view, and beyond it the desert, broad and vast and entirely itself, unconcerned with the human business of boundaries and warrants and love stories and justice, continuing its enormous ancient existence regardless, which Alfred found comforting in the specific way that very large things are comforting, when you understand that their indifference is not hostile, but simply much older than. Gerald James at 4, had developed a habit of sitting with them at the window table and asking questions that were remarkable in their specificity and required actual answers, which Alfred found he was very much in favor of. He answered the questions honestly and completely, which took time, and Sadie answered the ones he did not have answers to. And between them, Gerald James received an education in the evening over dinner that was different from what any school in the territory could have provided. He asked about boundaries one evening, which was inevitable given whose son he was. Alfred told him that a boundary was where one thing ended and another began, and that knowing exactly where boundaries were was one of the most important kinds of knowing, because a great deal of human suffering came from people pretending they did not know, or pretending the lines were different from what they were. Gerald James considered this with the weighty seriousness of a 4-year-old engaged with an important concept. Like the marker that got moved, he asked, because he had heard the Henderson story. Exactly like that, Sadie said. We moved it back, Gerald James said, with a certainty that was about 10% his own understanding and 90% absorbed from the people who had raised him and who had the word, we, very deep in how they understood the world. Yes, Alfred said. We moved it back. Clara, who was 18 months old and did not yet have the vocabulary to participate in the discussion, made a definitive sound from her chair that suggested she had her own views on the subject, which was consistent with everything else about her. The years wound forward in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary losses and complications of human life in a demanding landscape, but with the particular texture of a life that has been built deliberately by people who know what they want and have chosen each other with clear eyes. There were hard seasons. A drought year in 1891 that hit the territory badly and required the kind of sustained effort that left everyone tired and short of temper. A illness that took Gerald James in the winter of 1892, serious enough that for 3 terrible weeks Alfred and Sadie existed in the specific suspended dread of parents watching a sick child, pacing the same rooms, talking to the doctor in the careful measured language of people who are managing the distance between hope and preparation for a different outcome. Gerald James recovered with the emphatic completeness that characterized everything he did, and the first morning he came to the breakfast table with his normal appetite and his normal questions. Alfred excused himself from the table and stood in the yard for 10 minutes in the cold winter air with his hands over his face, and was grateful with a totality that he could not have expressed and did not need to. Clara, at 6, had by then firmly established herself as a person of exceptional technical inclination and limited patience for activities that did not engage her considerable intellect, which Sadie found delightful and Alfred found exactly what he should have expected, and both of them navigated by providing her with a steady supply of interesting problems, which was the only reliable way to keep her happily occupied for extended periods. She liked numbers with the particular early affinity that occasionally indicates something genuine, and Sadie began teaching her the mathematical foundations of surveying when she was 6.5, which was early, but Clara's progress through the material made the question of timing feel retrospectively irrelevant. She had her mother's spatial intuition and her father's methodical attention, and the specific combination produced something that neither of them was quite ready to define yet, but that they watched with a quiet, careful joy. In the spring of 1893, Sadie was offered the position of Regional Chief Surveyor for the Bureau of Land Management, covering a jurisdiction that included all of New Mexico Territory and the southern boundary regions of Colorado. It was a federal position, salaried, with the professional standing of the most senior survey appointment in the region. She would be the first woman to hold the position. She discussed it with Alfred for 3 evenings in succession, which was unusual because she was not generally a person who needed to discuss decisions extensively to arrive at them. She was being careful with this one. The travel requirements are significant, she said, on the second evening. The children are young. There are aspects of the role that would change the daily work in ways I'm not entirely comfortable with. What are the aspects you are comfortable with? Alfred asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the maps on the wall. The scope of it, the ability to establish standards for the entire regional survey practice, the opportunity to build the kind of professional infrastructure that would continue to function correctly long after I'm no longer in the position. That sounds like the most important work you could do, Alfred said. Yes, she agreed. It also sounds like the work I've been building toward for 16 years. She looked at him. It would require us to move to Santa Fe. I know. You would need to establish your survey practice there. I could do that. It is more city than you are accustomed to. Sadie, he said. She waited. You have been building toward this since before you met me. You built the case that made it possible. You trained the surveyors who are now recommending you for it. This is the completion of a thing you started, and I will follow you to Santa Fe or anywhere else you need to be, because your work matters and because anywhere you are is the place I want to be. He paused. Also, Gerald James has been saying he wants to go to a proper school, and Santa Fe has one. Sadie looked at him for a moment with the expression that still, after 9 years, made him feel that the ground had shifted beneath him in the best possible way. I'm going to accept it, she said. Yes, he said. You are. She accepted it. They moved to Santa Fe in the summer of 1893, which was an upheaval that the children handled with the adaptability of young people who had been raised in a household that treated change as information rather than threat. Gerald James was 8, absorbed and interested in everything about the new city. Clara was 4, and delivered several confident judgments about their new house in Santa Fe that were both accurate and unsolicited, which was entirely characteristic. Alfred established his survey practice in Santa Fe within 6 months, working initially on a contracted basis with the territorial land offices, and then increasingly as an independent expert, the kind of surveyor who is called in when a boundary question has become disputed enough to require someone whose judgment both sides will accept. He had a reputation, accumulated carefully over 9 years of legitimate work, for exactness and for professional integrity, which were the same reputation and the only kind he wanted. He was, in Santa Fe, occasionally recognized as the man from the Holloway case. A federal examiner mentioned it once. A journalist for the territory's largest paper had asked about it, and once a young surveyor who had just come out of training had told him with considerable earnestness that the Holloway case had been discussed in his survey training as an example of how falsified boundary records could be identified through systematic comparison of correction filings. The young surveyor had also asked Alfred if he had worked with the chief regional surveyor on the case, meaning Sadie, and Alfred had told him yes with the specific quiet pride of a man who understands that the right answer to that question involves no embellishment whatsoever. Sadie in the regional chief surveyor position was Sadie with a larger canvas, which meant she was substantially more formidable and considerably busier, and entirely, thoroughly in her element. She traveled more, which meant that Alfred was frequently managing the household and the children's schedules, and the general domestic operation with his own practice fitted around it. And he did this without complaint, and with a competence that surprised people who had assumptions about how such arrangements worked, which Alfred found mildly irritating and generally did not comment on. He had, over the years, acquired a reputation among the territory's domestic community as a man who was reliably present and practically capable, which he considered simply the correct state of affairs, and which the women in his circle considered remarkable with an enthusiasm he found disproportionate and Sadie found deeply funny. "You are a curiosity to them," she told him one evening, with the smile she had that was specifically for the things she found privately hilarious. "I am doing ordinary things," Alfred said. "Yes," Sadie said, "that is why you are a curiosity." He thought about that. Then he said, "That is depressing." "It is," she agreed. "Also it is improving slowly because you are an example. I did not volunteer to be an example. You are one anyway. This is the nature of doing things correctly in public." He accepted this with the equanimity of a man who has learned that his wife is generally right about how the world works and that arguing the point takes energy he could better spend on other things. Gerald James at 12 was, in the considered assessment of his teachers, a student of exceptional analytical ability who would benefit from being challenged more consistently, which was the educational establishment's way of saying that the material was not keeping up with him, and could someone please do something about it. Sadie worked with his teachers to develop a program that expanded into survey mathematics and territorial law, which were the fields that seemed to genuinely engage him, and Alfred began taking him on field surveys during the school holidays, which turned out to be the best educational intervention anyone had tried, because Gerald James on a survey was a version of himself that was more engaged and more focused than in any classroom. He had his mother's gift for space, the ability to read a terrain feature and understand its boundary implications, and he had developed his father's skill at recognizing when something in a survey record did not match the physical reality, the small discrepancies that mattered. Clara at 8 was already doing mathematical calculations that she was not supposed to be able to do for several more years, which her teacher had noted with a combination of admiration and mild bewilderment. She had decided that she was going to be an engineer, which was a profession that did not yet, in 1897, accommodate women in any formal institutional sense, and which she discussed with the complete assurance of someone who had not yet learned that she was supposed to find this discouraging. Sadie did not tell her she should find it discouraging. Alfred did not tell her this either. They told her to learn everything she could and to be extraordinarily good at it, because being extraordinarily good at something was the strongest argument available against anyone who wanted to tell you that you did not belong. This was, Alfred reflected, the advice both of them had lived. It was the truest thing they knew. The century turned with the particular mixture of ceremony and ordinary continuation that marks any large threshold. The year 1900 arrived in Santa Fe with parties and speeches, and the general human tendency to treat an arbitrary calendar boundary as though it contained cosmic significance, which Alfred found mildly absurd and Sadie found anthropologically interesting. Gerald James was 15. Clara was 11. Sadie was 44, and at the height of her professional influence, a woman who was consulted by federal authorities, whose opinions on boundary law were cited in official proceedings, and who was in the process of completing a comprehensive manual of boundary survey practices for the Bureau of Land Management that would become, in subsequent years, the standard reference for territorial surveyors across the western United States. Alfred was 46 and in excellent health and in possession of a survey practice that was, by any measure, a success, and in possession of a life that was, by every measure he had learned to use, exactly what a life should be. He thought sometimes about the man who had ridden through the Cimarron corridor at midnight in the spring of 1884, convinced he had made the worst mistake of his life. The warrant, the bounty hunters, the exhausted, guarded, quietly desperate man who had walked into a small land office in the desert expecting nothing, and had found his name on a piece of paper in a woman's handwriting. He thought about what it meant that she had seen him coming, that she had prepared a place for him, that the very thing he had been running from, exposure, documentation, the official recording of his existence, had turned out to be the mechanism of his safety rather than his destruction, because the right person had been holding the pen. He told her this one evening, in the house in Santa Fe that had their maps on the walls and their survey equipment in the hallway and 2 children somewhere in the rooms above them doing the things that children do, and the window facing west where the sky was doing something remarkable with the last of the day's light. He told her what it had meant, the permit, the preparation, the specific act of making a place where he could arrive legally safely as himself. Sadie listened to him in the complete and attentive way she listened to things that mattered, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment. "I thought, when my contact in Santa Fe told me about you," she said, "that you might be exactly what I needed to complete the case. I thought it was a professional matter." She paused. "The permit was professional. The 2 days after that, when I added your name to the transit record and found myself checking the road 3 times a day, those were not entirely professional." Alfred looked at her. "You were watching for me," he said. "I was watching for you," she confirmed. "Which was, I told myself, simply due diligence." "And what do you tell yourself now?" Sadie's expression did the thing that still, 16 years on, made the ground shift pleasantly beneath him. The small, real, unguarded thing. "That it was entirely due diligence," she said, with the particular quality of a woman who is enjoying a private joke at her own younger self's expense, "and also that I have been glad every day since that you crossed through Corridor 7. He reached across and took her hand, which was still slightly ink-stained and still warm and still entirely itself. And she held his, and they sat at the window, while the western sky made its extravagant statement with color and the city of Santa Fe went about its evening business outside, and the house around them held the comfortable, particular weight of a shared life, deeply lived. Outside, Gerald James was in the yard with a measuring chain, checking a boundary he had marked earlier in the day with stakes, because he was his mother's son, and could not see an unmarked boundary without the instinct to document it precisely. Inside, Clara was almost certainly reading a book about structural engineering that she had borrowed from her father's professional library and had not returned, which was a pattern Alfred had decided to find endearing rather than address directly. Above them, the sky did its enormous ancient work, indifferent and beautiful, drawing no lines at all. Below it, 2 people who had found each other at the edge of a legal boundary, in a desert land office, over a transit permit that should not have existed, sat at the window and were, in the simplest and most complete sense of the word, home. Some years later, when Gerald James was grown and had taken up his own survey work in the Northern Territories, and Clara had done exactly what she said she would do, and was making her presence known in the new century's engineering profession with a precision and force that surprised everyone who had not grown up watching Sadie Hale work, Alfred found the original transit permit again. He was going through the document box, sorting some of the older papers, and there it was, the federal seal. The boundary designation. His name in her handwriting, neat and precise, written 2 days before he arrived, by a woman who had seen him coming and had prepared a legal place for him in the world. He held it for a long moment. Then he went and found Sadie, who was at her desk in the study, working on a correspondence to a colleague, because Sadie would always be at her desk working, which was one of the permanent truths of the world, like mountains and desert light. He put the permit on the desk beside her work. She looked at it and then at him. "Corridor 7, she said. "Corridor 7, he agreed. She picked it up, looked at it with the expression she used for old and important documents, the particular attention of a woman who understood that paper preserved things. "You know," Alfred said, "I never properly thanked you for this." Sadie set the permit down and looked up at him with the gray eyes that he had been reading for 16 years and intended to spend the rest of his life reading. "You have been thanking me," she said, "every single day." He leaned down and kissed her on the top of her head, into the auburn hair that was threaded through with silver now, and that still, inexplicably, smelled faintly of cedar. And she turned her face up and kissed him back properly, with the same decisive, unsentimental, wholehearted quality that characterized everything she did, and that was the most wonderful thing in his world and always had been. Outside the window, New Mexico in the early light of the new century stretched wide and bright and full of boundaries that needed to be known, and Alfred Talbot, who had once been a man without a place to arrive, was exactly where he was supposed to be.